Hello, I'm Katie, and welcome back to our Katie and James blog. Are you feeling bullied? Back to the office, you're not alone. In this section, we're looking at what to do when you feel anxious, and particularly what to say to your manager. And we will have 5 tips for you about what to say. Now, feeling bullied is a deeply unpleasant feeling. And James and I have been remembering times in our working career when we felt bullied, forced back into the office. James once felt he had to come back off vacation. Another time when I was on maternity leave, I felt I was being forced back to work earlier than I wanted to. Now, what happens is it's incredibly physical. So we start to feel the shortness of breath. We may start to sweat. Our guts may spasm. We start to have all kinds of feelings. We may feel anxious, powerless. We may start to feel rebellious or angry. And these are very normal human reactions. But what they cause us to do is to want to fight, or alternatively, to want to flee. I mean, get out of there literally as fast as we can and quit. And emotions are contagious. Just think of a quiet auditorium and that nervous cough that somehow travels from human being to human being very, very quickly and moves across the room. Well, human emotions travel through the laptop too, through Zoom and through Microsoft Teams. And we think employers forget that at their peril, don't we, James?
Absolutely, Katie. And as Katie says, you're not alone. Fear about returning to the office is rampant. In August, Katie and I read copious accounts in the news and heard from people in our network all over the world about more and more of you being told to come back into the office 2, 3, even 5 full days a week. A recent study by the Limeade Institute polled 4,500 adults across 5 countries. That's 4,500 adults across 5 countries. 100% of respondents said they were anxious about returning to the workplace. We read survey after survey. It's clear that a significant percentage of employees vehemently want to remain working from home. A hot off the press study from Harvard and London Business School professors Gino and Cable indicates that 82% of respondents were anxious about returning to work. And what's more, Katie, that re-entry anxiety decreases work engagement and intentions to quit. That compounds this vicious cycle. As we know this from all the young millennials that we talk to and who we work with and who are polishing their CVs and their LinkedIns.
Absolutely. I mean, so I think we're seeing there's a lot of that this being forced back causes increasing disenchantment, disengagement, and then wanting to quit. But what is this anxiety about? I mean, I think first and foremost, obviously, it's about our physical health, right? And Delta, the variant we're facing right now, we don't know what's to come as we move in the months ahead. But Delta is highly contagious. So there was an incident in the US where I live this past week. So elementary primary school teacher, unvaccinated, took her mask off for reading time. And a few days later, 50% of the class tested positive for COVID. So you just think about the implications of that story for traveling on public transport or being back in the office if there are unvaccinated employees walking around without masks on. I mean, it gets a little scary. In the next section, we're going to dig into the impact of long COVID and also look a bit about what happens if you get a breakthrough infection. Suffice to say, and the Lancet reported on this week, we have a public health crisis looming over long COVID. It's not just a case with COVID that we kind of get it, we get some medication, we come back, and maybe a week or so later, we're back to 400% health again. Oh, no. COVID's in a whole other category. And the majority of people who have had COVID have at least one long COVID symptom. So our physical health, I think, is a big part of it. Then there's the question, what if I've had asthma or pneumonia? And asthma, of course, is hugely common. So that ups the ante some more. So I think fear for our physical health, very real, very natural. Then there's our mental health. And I want to focus sort of directly on the returning to work element of this. We'll talk more broadly in the next section on the evidence around mental health and the pandemic. But 1 in 3 workers who have returned to work said it had a detrimental effect on their mental health. This increases for parents up to nearly 50% of those returners who have kids, which is hardly surprising, right? Because the under 12s, most countries not yet vaccinated. So you're worried about bringing COVID home. And of course, if you've got a kid compromised in any way, again, even with something like asthma, you're very nervous around that. And then there's the situation of women of color who've been surveyed. Now, the workplace isn't inclusive. We've been working very hard for decades to try and make it more inclusive, but the fact is it still isn't. And women of color feel these microaggressions day in, day out, where they're saying, guess what? They don't want to go back to such an inhospitable, uninclusive workplace. So watch out, HR, because I think that has real implications. So physical health, mental health, James, very important, but I think you have another reason why people are anxious.
Absolutely, Katie. You touch on 2 really important ones, physical and mental, perhaps the ones that we see in the press the most. But one that we know that is incredibly important as well is our fear of loss of freedom. Working from home has given us greater control over our work schedule than we've ever had before. We can determine our own timetables. We've been able to step off that treadmill of commuting, working, commuting. And workers are fearful of losing that autonomy. I mean, we know it from research over decades, and Dan Pink has brought it to our attention in his work, that the 3 top motivators, top engagement components are autonomy, are mastery, and our purpose. And Katie and I are going to be talking with you about these 3 in future blogs. But we know that loss of freedom results in things like marked stress response. And this was reported by the BBC, increased hormones such as cortisol and adrenaline, quickened heartbeats and gastric ulcers, all sorts of things that affect our physical and our mental health. Also, we know from recent studies that Generation Z value their freedom, including freedom of expression and workplace flexibility. I don't know, all of this makes a lot of sense to me, Katie. Does it resonate with you?
Oh, absolutely. So let me think about my Gen Z for a moment down there in DC. And boy, does he value his freedom. I mean, he actually says to me, I wouldn't take a job, Mum, unless it offered me flexibility. And I do think we don't talk enough about our need for autonomy and how the lack of it impacts on us in very stressful ways for our physical and mental health. I once wrote a poem, I don't think I ever told you this, James, called I'm on an escalator I can't get off, about those feelings of powerlessness when working on Wall Street. So I think these are really, really important. But that's enough about why we're afraid to go back in. What, James, do we say to our manager?
Well, first of all, you're not a snowflake and don't allow yourself to be treated as one. You're not a child and you're not imagining your symptoms. So you need to stay calm and keep your emotions in check. Being rebellious or emotional has a lot of downsides to it. So staying calm, gathering the facts, and we have plenty of facts in our long blog, and provide evidence both of your medical and your mental health, your own specific data, as well as more general data. You might want to include doctor's notes or diagnoses, but stay calm and gather your facts. Secondly, don't send an email in a moment of emotional turmoil. Give yourself some time to sleep on it. Show it to someone you trust, to a colleague. Use somebody as a sounding board to get advice before sending it. Some of you may have even received emails today from HR saying that you can't work from home tomorrow, Or perhaps you can't work from another country or another location. Or maybe you wrote to your manager and your manager never bothered to write back. You're going to be in high emotion. Bang that email out, write that email, but put it aside, sleep on it, and get some feedback before sending.
It reminds me, James, of the advice I've given countless times, I'm sure you have, over the decades, to senior leaders, where I would say, save this draft, save this draft. Do you see that over there? Could you just do that? So I think it's really important advice, that one. Number 3, what are you willing to do? Let's be enthusiastic where we can. So I know some people are being asked to go back to meetings. Some of those are going to be held outdoors. We'll say yes. I mean, things that we feel we can do, let's be enthusiastic. So that brings me on to number 4, find colleagues. There's lots of them who feel like you. I know many of you might feel terribly alone, but there'll be people on your team, in your department, in your company who feel like you. Now, if we just take Apple, for example, and their Slack channel on working from home and remote working, 8,000 employees. I'm sure it's even more than that now. That's the last number I saw reported. But these can be really, really affected. So it's important to take your messages individually. You can also band together. And I think that can be incredibly effective. You be persistent, you take them up the hierarchy, you repeat them over and over, and this becomes very powerful. So find colleagues, repeat messages. Which brings me on to number 5, social media channels. Now, James and I are really looking at these with a great deal of excitement and curiosity right now as we see their growth. We've been looking at some, particularly in financial services, where they've been talking on Instagram. Some of these sites have really big followership and sharing details of compensation. And I think that's become quite effective. I think they can be hugely effective and create movements around flexibility, working from home. So speak out there. We'll be interested in saying that, in viewing that and joining in the conversations. And as we set up our discussion posts with Katie and James, join them. I mean, I think this is a vitally important conversation to have, a conversation that we can have in increasing numbers, and it will be effective. So those are our 5 tips. Next section, what are we going to cover? Well, we're going to look at those inconvenient truths, as we're calling them. We've got 7, I think, of them that we see are being covered up, denied, or ignored by employers. So stay tuned and join that conversation.